The Name 2, Part 2 of 4. This is to tell you that, in relation to this, and by inserting it in relation to this, in a way that anticipates its function, it is not by chance that the issue we find ourselves facing, as we try to advance in this direction, is the relationship that is immediately incarnated, that manifests itself here, of the most primary coalescence between the signifier and something that immediately poses the question of what is negation. What is it closest to being? Is negation simply a connotation, which hence nevertheless proposes itself as the question of the moment in which, in relation to existence, to exercising, to the constitution of the signifying chain, a kind of indication, a superimposed logo that gets inserted, a useful word with which it is expressed, which should hence always be conceived of as a kind of secondary invention created by the necessities of the utilization of something that is situated at various levels? Is it at the level of the response? That which it is a question of in the signifying effect of the interrogative sentence, is that not there? Is it at the level of the response that this ness, which seems to manifest itself very much in the French language as the possibility of the pure omission of the negation, no? Is it, on the other hand, that within the mark of the relations imposed by the negation, what is suggested is that, by the necessity of this disjunction, such a thing is not if such a thing is, or could not be with such another thing, in short, negation as instrument? We know it definitely no less than anyone else, but if, for what is thus to do with the genesis of language, one is reduced there to make signify something that must be elaborated bit by bit on the basis of an emotive sign, the problem of the negation is something that poses itself as one that is, correctly speaking, a leap or even an impasse. If making something completely different of the signifier, something with a problematic genesis, something that brings us to the level of questioning a certain existential relationship, one that is as such already situated in reference to negativity, the mode in which the negation appears, in which the signifier of an effective and lived negativity can emerge, is something that takes on a totally different aspect, and one that is not henceforth, as it happens, without being of a nature that can enlighten us, when we see that, right from the first issues of praxis, the structuration of language is identified with, if one may say so, the detection of the first conjugation of a vocal emission with the sign, as such, meaning with something that is already referring to an initial way of handling the object. We have called it a process of simplification when it has been a question of defining the genesis of the mark. What is there that is more destroyed, more effaced than an object, when it is the object that arises from the mark? The mark retains something of the object precisely in its unary form. The effacement, the absolute destruction of all its other ways of emerging, of all its prolongations, of all its other appendages, of all its possible ramifications, of anything that could palpitate from it. Ah well! This relationship between the object and the birth of something that gets called the sign here, insofar as it is of interest to us in the birth of the signifier, it is very much on this question that we took pause, and on this question that is not without promise, that we have made, if one may say so, a discovery, for I believe that it is one, this indication that there is, let's say, a certain detectable, historically specific time, a moment when something is there to be read with language, when writing isn't yet there. And it's through the reversal of the relationship, and of the relationship of the reading of the sign, that writing can subsequently be born, insofar as it can be used to connote phonemization. But at this level it appears that precisely the proper noun, insofar as it specifies as such the taking root of the subject, is more especially linked than anything else not to phoneticization, to the structure of language as such, but to that which is already there, ready in language, ready to receive the news, if one may say so, of the mark. If the proper noun still carries the trace of it, precisely for us and in our usage, in this form such that from one language to another it does not translate, since it is simply transposed, transferred, well, this is very much what characterizes it. I am called Lacan in every language, and it's the same for you, each by your name. This here is not a contingent fact, a limiting factor, an impotence, a nonsensical aspect. On the contrary, it is here that the completely specific properties of the proper noun, of the name, are lodged, reside within signification. The way this is done, doesn't it make us ask ourselves what is this radical, archaic point which we have to assume as an absolute necessity to be there at the source of the unconscious? Meaning something by which, insofar as the subject speaks, he can only advance by going further into the chain through a progression of énoncés, statements, but that by definition, in heading towards the énoncés, something is elided in the énonciation, utterance, which is correctly speaking that which he cannot know, i.e. the name of what he is as subject of the énonciation. In the act of the énonciation, there is this latent naming that is conceivably the first knot as signifier of that which is subsequently going to be organized as a chain revolving, as I have always shown it to you, around this centre, this speaking heart of the subject that we call the unconscious. Here, before we go any further, I think I need to point something out that is nothing but the convergence, the apex of a theme that we have already broached several times in this seminar. Several times in taking it up at various levels at which Freud was led to broach it, represent the system, the first system of the psyche, such as he had to represent it, in such a way as to make people realize what it is about, the system that is formulated as unconscious, preconscious, conscious. Umpteen times I have had to depict on this blackboard, elaborated in various forms, the paradoxes with which Freud's formulations at the level of the Entwurf, for example, confront us. Today I will stick with a topologization that is as straightforward as the one he gives at the end of the interpretation of dreams, i.e. the one with separated layers across which there may be breaches, thresholds, eruptions from one level to another, like those which are our key point of interest, the passage from the unconscious to the preconscious, for example, which is indeed a problem, which is a problem. Besides, in passing, I note with satisfaction it is certainly not the least impact that I could have expected from the rigorous effort that I am training you up for, that I impose on myself for you here, and that those who hear me, who listen to me, themselves take to a degree that is even susceptible on occasion to going further. Ah well, in their very remarkable article published in Les Temps Modernes on the subject of the unconscious, Laplanche and Leclerc, I am not at the moment distinguishing each one's part in this work, question the ambiguity that remains in the Freudian énonciation concerning what happens when we can speak about the passage of something that was in the unconscious and that goes into the preconscious. Does that mean that it is just a change of placement, as they very justifiably pose the question, or is there then a double inscription? The authors don't hide their preference for the double inscription, they indicate it in their text. This is, however, a problem that the text leaves open, and in the end, what we are working on this year will perhaps allow us to respond in some way, or at least to bring some clarification. I want, by way of introduction, to suggest this to you, that if we must consider the unconscious to be this place in the subject where it speaks, this brings us to approaching this point where we can say that something, unbeknownst to the subject, is profoundly remodelled by the retroactive effects of the signifier involved in the speaking. As long as, and with even the slightest utterance, the subject speaks, what he can't help but do is always, once more, to name her himself without knowing it, and without knowing with what name. Can't we see that, in order to position the unconscious and the preconscious within their relationship, the boundary for us is not initially to be positioned somewhere in the interior of a subject, as one says, which would just be the equivalent of what is called, in a broad sense, the psyche, A subject that concerns us, and especially if we are trying to formulate it as the unconscious subject, entails a boundary that is constituted in a different way. What it is for the preconscious, insofar as what interests us in the preconscious is the language such that effectively not only do we see it, do we hear it speak, but such that it chants, it articulates our thoughts. Everyone knows that the thoughts concerned at the level of the unconscious, even if I say that they are structured like a language, of course it is insofar as they are, in the last resort and at a certain level, structured like a language, that they are of interest to us. But the first thing to note for the thoughts we are talking about is that it is not easy to express them in everyday language. It's about seeing that the language articulated in everyday discourse, in relation to the subject of the unconscious as it is of interest to us, is on the outside. An outside that links within it what we call our intimate thoughts and this language that runs about outside, not without carrying some weight, since, as we all know, because there are all sorts of things that represent it for us, we know what cultures in which everything happens by word of mouth perhaps don't know. We who have kilos of language in front of us, and who, into the bargain, know how to inscribe the most fleeting utterances onto discs, we know very well that what is uttered, the actual discourse, the preconscious discourse, is entirely homogenizable as something that stands outside. Language as a substance runs about in the streets, and therein there is effectively an inscription on magnetic tape if need be. The problem of what happens when the unconscious comes along and makes itself heard is the problem of the boundary between this unconscious and this preconscious. This boundary, how do we have to see it? It's a problem that, for the moment, I am going to leave open. But what we can indicate on this occasion is that, on passing from the unconscious to the preconscious, what is constituted in the unconscious encounters an already existing discourse, an unfettered game of signs, if you will, not only messing with the real, but, it can be said, tightly interconnected, as if there is a mycelium woven between them. Just as with, and isn't this here the true reason for what can be called the fascination of its appeal, the entanglement of idealism within philosophical inquiry? If man realizes, or believes he realizes, that he only ever has ideas of things, meaning that of things, in the end, he only knows the ideas, this is precisely because already, in the world of things, this wrapping up in a universe of discourse is something that is absolutely inextricable. The preconscious is, quite simply, previously and already in the real, and the status of the unconscious, if it poses a problem, it is insofar as it is constituted at a completely different level, at the more radical level of the emergence of the act of enunciation. There is not, in principle, any objection to the passage of something from the unconscious to the preconscious. That is what tends to happen, the contradictory nature of which Laplanche and Leclerc pick up on so well.